IT Committee, and at this point in time, we do not have a quorum of the Budget Committee. We have two members of each of the committees here. It takes at least two members of the IT Committee to have a quorum. It takes at least three members of the Budget Committee to have a quorum. We have the items listed on the agenda as items 1, 2, and 3, and we will commence with item number 1, Mr. Chairman. Does that work? Okay. Item number 1.
For item 1, there is a motion before you relative to the feasibility of removing underutilized fleet equipment and vehicles from fleet operations citywide.
Okay, hold on a second. Can you please announce item number 2? We'll take them together. Does that work for you?
For item 2, which is related, the Chief Legislative Analyst and the City Administrative Officer have submitted a joint report relative to fleet consolidation.
Okay, they've been announced. Would like to open?
Angela Sherrick, Department of General Services.
A little closer to the microphone, please.
Angela Sherrick, Department of General Services. With regards to item 1 and the motion that was introduced regarding the fleet utilization study, the Department of General Services has contracted with a vendor to complete the study. The vendor is Arroyo Associates. The contract was awarded in October. The utilization study has in fact started. We have issued 1,600 surveys for the first phase of the report. The report will actually be done in 3 phases. We have received 1,400 surveys back. This is about an 86% return on the survey so far. We're working with the departments that haven't turned them in completely, but we do believe that we'll get everything back. Our plan is on the first phase to actually start meeting with the departments next week to talk about vehicles that are underutilized or low-use vehicles, and we have given a copy of the motion to all of the departments. The second phase of the study has already begun, and that is to send surveys out on the off-road vehicles. For those numbers of surveys, we actually sent out about 1,400 surveys, and the due date for those surveys was last Friday, so we haven't analyzed the data yet. But again, we will be meeting with the departments beginning next week on the first phase.
I have a question to you. Just to clarify at the beginning of this discussion, when it comes to vehicles that have been assigned to various departments, and whether a department has 2 vehicles or 200 vehicles or what have you, when those vehicles are in the possession of those departments, is it the GSD's authority to unassign that vehicle, or whose authority is to unassign a vehicle?
It is not in GSD's authority to unassign that vehicle. Generally, if a vehicle is in the possession of a department, that means they've gone through the budget process to actually have those vehicles assigned to them. So they would actually put a budget package in and request vehicles to be assigned to their department. And what GSD does is actually create the specifications, order the vehicles, and then we do the maintenance once the vehicles come in. So with respects to actually taking them away from the departments, GSD does not have the authority to do that, and that's one of the reasons that it's very beneficial and helpful to us that the motion came out to help us start the utilization study and to help us start meeting with the departments.
Okay, thank you, because there's been quite a bit of frustration with the fact that the mayor gave a directive to all departments that we should all look at reducing the number of vehicles that we have in circulation with the city of Los Angeles government, and there's been a bit of frustration that the numbers have not changed as much as people had hoped. But I just wanted to make sure that that frustration isn't directed in the wrong place. And Department of General Services is in fact in charge with a lot of matters, but they are not the policy decision maker as to who gets a vehicle, and they do not direct a department as to whether or not they need to give up a vehicle, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that.
Okay, so for the second item, Mandana Khatib Shahidi, CLA's office. On May 11th, 2010, Council directed the offices of the CLA and the CAO to evaluate the consolidation of fleet operations for GSD, LAPD, and LAFD. a working group was convened, including the CLA, CAO, fleet managers from the 3 fleet departments just mentioned, as well as representatives from CD6 and CD12. During the course of our research for this report, we conducted several meetings, interviews, site visits of fleet facilities, and we reviewed staffing levels, vehicle equipment availability, and options to address the staffing shortages faced by each of the 3 departments. The city, if you turn to page 2 in the report, it's Table 1 Fleet Overview. That'll give you an overview of the city's entire fleet with a breakdown by department. So the city's fleet is comprised of 63 facilities total, with approximately 17,000 vehicles, equipment, which include automobiles, light, medium, heavy-duty trucks, construction equipment, and miscellaneous equipment such as lawnmowers. What we learned in preparation for this report was that while the fleet inventory has remained relatively the same for all 3 departments, their staffing levels have significantly declined, and the staffing continues to decrease as a result of regular retirement, ERIP, and attrition. In fact, currently, GSD, LAPD, and LAFD have a vacancy rate of anywhere between 25 to 35%. This shortage in staffing has led to a decrease in the number of available vehicles and equipment. And this continued reduction of available vehicles will ultimately have greater operational and, in some cases, fiscal impacts. For instance, for LAPD, if they continue to delay non-urgent or miscellaneous repairs, they cite that eventually their fleet will deteriorate and down the line could require a greater number of replacement vehicles. For fire department, they use a reserve fleet to back up their frontline emergency apparatus, and if the reserve fleet is unavailable, that could ultimately lead to a shortage of emergency apparatus, which could also impact sworn deployment. For GSD, which actually services 24 different departments, all of its customers will somehow be affected, such as street services and sanitation. So we've identified basically 5 alternatives for trying to mitigate the staffing shortages, which include overtime, contracting out, 90-day rehires of retired city employees, sharing resources and facilities, and reducing the fleet. You should note that overtime, contracting, and 90-day rehires would require and be contingent upon additional funding. So as an immediate solution to address the staffing shortages, the fleet managers have come together and developed a draft memorandum of agreement that could potentially result in some moderate savings, but definitely improve fleet efficiencies. And they can go into the details of that. For the long term, what we've concluded is that ultimately fleet reduction is the best way to address these staffing shortages, which would balance the available labor and workload. We'll continue, our offices, the CLA and CAO, will continue to keep the council apprised of any changes in progress in fleet operations. And you should note that our next report backs will include the results of the fleet utilization study, alternatives to current furlough days and work shifts, and an analysis of LAPD and LAFD take-home vehicles. And the fleet departments are here available for any questions you may have.
So according to the tables that I'm looking at, it appears that based on what was budgeted in the budget process, LAPD has about 1/3 vacancies in this category of workforce. LA Fire Department has just over 25% vacancy, and GSD has the lowest percentage of vacancy, but they do have a higher number of vehicles. GSD is servicing 11,000 vehicles. So I have a question to the police department and also the fire department. How are you managing with that many vacancies in just one category of, from my perspective, I would call it critical staffing, because fire department, you have some of the heaviest rigs in town.
Yes, sir.
And then police department, you probably have more miles put on a vehicle by an officer than maybe any other category in the city fleet. So,
Right.
You want to go ahead?
Okay. Well, right off the bat, fire fleet, given that we're down 25% on our HEMs, basically what's happening is those apparatus that are currently in line for repairs are stacking up. Right now, we have 11 aerial trucks, and we have about 20 triple pumpers that are sitting down at supply and maintenance awaiting repairs. I also am in charge of Frank Hoskins and have given permission to stack and additional apparatus at our other location because we don't have enough room for the repairs that are waiting in line. So to sum it up for you, how does that affect the city? Basically is by charter we have to have 100% staffing out in the field, and we have, we'll just round number, 100 apparatus out in the field responding to incidents. We have a backup reserve, and that reserve supply is now at critical levels. So
I was just going to ask you, where's the tipping point? We're getting to that tipping point.
anywhere from 6 months to 18 months, depending on what happens in the city.
Thank you.
Sandy Jo MacArthur, the Police Department. The Police Department believes we're pretty much at that tipping point right now. The things that we have done to mitigate the problem is we've reduced our fleet already at some, which has helped. But we, as you well know, in the budget, we did not get any new vehicles this year. So all of the individuals who were assigned to installs are now doing regular maintenance, which is addressed in this report as well, the concerns that later on when we do need to get vehicles, that we'll be having to look at ways to address that problem, but that's for the next budget year. The other things that we are doing is we've closed some off-hour locations, or we oftentimes will rotate what off-hour location will be open. And we also have taken some of the administrative tracking of our vehicles and things like that, and we've actually turned that over to the bureaus, each of our geographic bureaus, to assist us with some of the tracking. So those are the things that we've done to mitigate, but we believe we're at our tipping point now.
So the things that you've been able to do to mitigate seem to be day-to-day management fixes, but those aren't ideal for you to keep long-term, correct?
That is correct. Especially once we start to bring in new vehicles, then we have the installs, and as you well know, that's very time-consuming.
Do you have any questions so far?
Let me just ask the fire department, I just want to clarify, when you said that by charter, you're obligated to deploy at 100%?
Constant staffing, it's mandated by the charter, and since we have to have X amount of apparatus staffed out in the field, in order to meet that, we have the responsibility to keep our service rate at a certain level, mandatory. Our current fleet requires 60,000 hours of maintenance a year, and right now we're falling behind.
That's the first I've heard this in charter. If you could share that with us, because what we've been advised is that it's a policy of the commission and the department. In fact, the way constant staffing was invented, and I'll age myself, is that Mayor Yorty proposed it to the fire department in order not to increase the size of the department. They came up with an overtime plan, but I didn't know it was in the charter.
I can get back to you on that.
All right, okay, so we can do that. The other issue,
Absolutely.
I was going to ask General Services, if you have no authority to cause departments to get rid of vehicles, but yet in our recent evaluation of FSR and operational plans, you have a plan to get rid of 2,000 vehicles. Are those within the purview of General Services? Are they going to come from other departments? Where do the 2,000 vehicles come from?
Those vehicles will actually come from other departments, and one of the things, getting back to the motion that was item 1, is going to help us to actually reduce the number of vehicles. That's what's going to help us to get to those 2,000.
So you now have you feel you have the authority now?
We believe that we have the authority, and as Mandana has said, we will be reporting back to ITGA to actually to tell where we are with actually doing those reductions.
Because one of the things I think when we look at your report on page 4, when we look at the issue of rehires, overtime, 90-day fiscal contracts. All of those require money, which I think, if I've calculated accurately, the three departments are sitting at the table represent about $60 to $70 million overage as of today in their three budgets. So there's probably not money laying around to go out to do any of these things. So the reduction of vehicles is absolutely essential. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, General Services is close to $2.5–3 million short on just the parts account.
That's correct.
Yeah.
We're projecting by the end of the year, though, that parts account deficit will be erased by several things that we outlined in our operational plan.
So these are things I think we have to concentrate on the 2,000, because there's just not money laying around to add to any of these other things. The other thing, I certainly appreciate all the work that was done on looking at how you merged and talked about how you can share, because that's been a long time coming also. And I think that's something that all of you should be commended to getting in the room and coming up with a plan, because for decades everybody had their own, nobody wanted to share, everybody says I got to do it all myself. This report is a good first step of showing that we can share mechanics, we can share facilities, we can share parts, and I think that's the way we're going to end up going. And I think the other issue of going out when you have a need, the best, the best return on your investment is at times going out to get a vendor to do it as opposed to hiring an employee. And so I think all those things are in our favor. I appreciate the fact that we're going to come back with a follow-up report on some of the other issues with home garaging and things that we've talked about now for a while. So I appreciate the information, but I just want to make sure that we concentrate on that 2,000, because there's just not money to make any of those other things work.
Now, can you clarify for us, because we now have on the record that you don't have the authority to unassign a vehicle, but you just explained that through the process and evaluation and analysis, you will be able to identify where we can actually reduce vehicles. But what confused me a little bit is the chairman, Parks, asked the question, and he specifically asked the question if you feel you have the authority to reduce vehicles. So how exactly do you affect the reduction of vehicles via your department?
What will actually happen is that through the utilization study, we've identified low-use vehicles.
Okay.
Now we are actually meeting with those departments. We've received feedback from each of those departments regarding those vehicles. We'll meet with them and we'll determine if, with their input, whether or not they agree that these are low-use vehicles. And then based on the council motion that you've put forward, we will be sending a report to council making recommendations on what vehicles.
Aha, that's it. So basically, you will be able to identify where, in fact, we can actually reduce the number of vehicles. Now, either those departments will give up those vehicles voluntarily, or through an action of the council, we will actually authorize you to hire a repo person or what have you, and then bring those vehicles back away from those departments, and then we'll deal with those vehicles as unassigned, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so see, that's what I thought you meant, but, so your answers are consistent. Basically, it's a policy decision, it's a department decision. It's a department decision first and foremost if they want to give up a vehicle that's been assigned to them, and they were given that authority by the council. Now, if they don't do that on their own, and then the council decides to reduce X number of identified vehicles from various departments or what have you, then it will be a council action, and then therefore you're charged with giving them the bad news and say, we're here to pick up the vehicle, correct? Something along those lines.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, yeah. And then therefore, as those vehicles would have gotten older, we don't have to replace a vehicle that no longer is assigned. So it has a short-term and a long-term effect on reducing the requirement of resources to not only purchase vehicles and renew them, but actually maintaining them as well.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions so far?
Okay, the cost of the contract that was done to do the survey, how much was that?
I believe the cost of the survey contract is about $104,000.
Okay, how come we couldn't have done that in-house?
because we don't have the resources, actually. It's something that we would have liked to have done in-house, but we just don't have the resources to do it. Right now, we're looking at a shortage in terms of positions in fleet of about 47 positions that we're short, and possibly more based on some of our deferred maintenance. So we just don't have the resources to do the study in-house. That would have been our choice.
But when you contact the different departments, the police department, the fire department, other departments, they give you the information on the vehicles. Police department, the four-wheel vehicles, two-wheel vehicles, special equipment vehicles, they provide that, or did this consultant actually go on site and count vehicles, or they just compile information from the different agencies?
What will happen, well, what the consultant has done is taken our vehicle management system, and they've actually done an analysis of the information in the system. And they've put together a survey that the departments have access to, and the survey is done online, and then they're analyzing that data. The next step for the consultants is that they will actually go out and meet with each department, and they will talk about the equipment, determine how it's used, why it's used, and why the departments think that they need to maintain it. And that's where that's where the resources actually take place, actually going out, meeting with the departments, and putting the report together.
Right now they're just looking at what's in the computer.
Correct, but starting next week, they're going to be meeting with the departments. And just to clarify, the utilization study at this point does not include police and fire.
Well, what are we going to do about them?
That will be a separate report back. That'll be sort of like a phase 2 after this report. The CLA and CAO will go back and evaluate the take-home vehicles for both police and fire and do another
Would that
report.
be another $104,000?
No, that will be done in-house.
Okay, because I'm just looking at what we could do to pay people, if take them off a furlough and have them do some of these administrative assignments, instead of paying some consultant $104,000, we could have taken care of some of our city employees.
In GSD's case, because they do provide maintenance services to 24 city departments, it's very broad-based and extensive work, and they just didn't have the resources at this time.
And then the age of the fleet, do we have an estimated age of the fleet for the city of Los Angeles, for all the different agencies within the city? Like the car, 5 years, 6 years, 7, 10 years, antiques? Have we analyzed that?
Our replacement schedule for GSD was at 7 years, but keep in mind, we've suspended purchases for equipment. So we haven't purchased equipment with the exception of things that council just approved, which is off-road sweepers and sanitation vehicles, for at least 2 years. So the age of the fleet has increased dramatically, and I think police and fire can speak to this also.
So it was 7-year replacement. What about mileage? Is that part of the criteria, or is it just age?
Actually, there is a mileage criteria also, but it's dependent upon the type of vehicle. GSD has a very extensive fleet, and we have a lot of different types of equipment. So the criteria differs depending on the type of equipment that you're talking about. So, for instance, a sweeper is different than a sedan, is different from a trash truck, is different from...
So it's all different.
Correct.
And then when we get those vehicles, what they're new, do we rely on the dealers to service them, or do we do that in-house?
We do rely on some on warranties. So anything that's under warranty, but with respect to preventive maintenance, we do preventive maintenance in-house.
Okay. Vehicles warranty. Equipment, vehicles. Okay, I've been to the LAFD yard, and it looks like a used car lot,
Yes.
because the number of vehicles that are in for repair. And I was just at West Valley last night, and they have an area where the cars are in for service. There's like 5 or 6 that are just sitting there. I don't know if they're getting serviced or not because of the lack of mechanics. It reminds me of a trip I made to South Africa, and I went to the South African Police Services, and I went on a ride-along, and I saw all these BMW cars sitting in the lot, and I said, why aren't we riding those? We don't have anybody to maintain them. We don't have any fuel to put in them, which is kind of interesting. When you have a fleet of vehicles, law enforcement vehicles, you don't have maintenance, and you have no fuel, and they just sit there collecting dust. When we're looking at this entire environment, are we looking at the other aspects of fueling them? We're looking at the aspects of keeping them running, because if you talk to the mechanics, they're saying that these things are going beyond replacement. It's beyond the fact that, in particular with the police department, they get 24-hour use. Have we looked at that to say when the fleet runs to the point that it exhausts itself? Like San Francisco, when we had some big fires and we called upon mutual aid, and San Francisco said we can't send anything because we don't have anything available because our fleet is down. I mean, we get to that critical point. Reading this, it looks like we're approaching that critical point.
One of the things that the
Those
utilization
aspects.
study will look at, again, is the age of the fleet, our replacement cycles, and, GSD's, our most important priority is safety. So we won't put anything on the road that's not safe. So if something is past the replacement cycle and we have determined that it's not safe, it just won't go on the road. So the utilization study that we've undertaken will also look at the amount of labor that it takes to do the vehicles, and we'll put in place standards on replacement also for the vehicles. So that's something that we're looking at right now.
And then police department, if they're involved in a pursuit, the car has been taken out of service for mechanics to check?
Yes, we still follow those procedures. And for our usage, we know the average age is about 6.3 years per vehicle, but we look at, when we take something out of service permanently, we look at the total mileage. That's what we're looking at. We're looking at approximately, I believe, 90,000 right now. We moved it to 115.
115,000 miles?
Back to when you and I were working the street.
Way back when. So if you have a division like Hollywood Division versus a division like Topanga or West Valley or West LA, where you've got greater territory to cover, do we make swaps within divisions?
I can explain that very quickly. What we do is monthly, we look at our vehicle usage, and quarterly then our motor transport division commanding officer meets with each of the commanding officers in the different bureaus and divisions, and we do move vehicles as needed to ensure that we're utilizing them properly. And starting in 2011, that will actually be ComStatted. So we are really trying to stretch our utilization. And on average, our vehicles are using, our black and whites are hitting 12,000 miles a year on average. And that's, I think, largely because we've been able to
Rotate them around?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then what about the fuel? I know we haven't discussed that in detail. Do we have provisions for that? Since we're talking about maintenance, and obviously part of maintenance is fueling them.
I'm sorry,
Gasoline. Have we looked into that, the aspect?
in terms of reducing the amount of gasoline based on
Well,
reduction?
to maintain that flow of gasoline to run the vehicles.
Well, right now, there's no problem with respects to petroleum. We have contracts in place. We have funding for the petroleum. We don't anticipate a problem in our operational plan. And in I think the financial status report, we put that there was a deficit in the petroleum account of about $1.5 million. However, we have $2 million in the unappropriated balance to cover that. So with respects to gasoline, we're in very good shape.
So we're basically stretching this rubber band to the maximum point.
With respects to maintenance on the vehicles, yes.
And for the fire department, the same situation as with everybody else.
Absolutely. We have replacement rate cycles, 6 to 7 years on non-emergency sedans. Some emergency sedans, 7 years. They're up in a lot of them out in the field, 150,000 miles, and they're over the 7-year replacement cycle. And then, of course, the triples and the aerial trucks are about 15 years, and then, of course, we go on with the tractors and all the others.
And if we calculated the maintenance, the repairs, I should say, with the high mileage vehicles, where we're replacing transmissions and other critical components which are expensive versus salvaging those vehicles, are we looking at that?
We have looked at that, and as I can tell by the question, you've already surmised that the older the vehicle, the more it costs to maintain it.
Well, I know a vehicle that has 140,000 miles that had to put a new transmission, and some other vehicles, other components. I'm saying, are we spending that kind of money, and how many more miles we can get out of it versus salvaging it and get something else? But we take that into consideration. Because, I mean, a lube and oil change is pretty simple, changing tires. When you're doing transmissions and other components, which obviously when they get up in mileage, that happens.
We do take that into consideration, and again, we have a replacement schedule. So we try to replace when we have the authority to purchase on our replacement cycle. So we do look at those things.
But for the foreseeable future, we don't plan to purchase any new vehicles or motorcycles or helicopters or anything?
With respects to sedans, vans, pickup trucks, we don't for the foreseeable future. With respects to construction equipment, trash trucks and sweepers, we have been given authority to purchase those vehicles through the last financial status report.
Okay, thank you.
Just have one question. We think we have approximately 2,000 vehicles and pieces of equipment. Is that what this Arrows study is pointing out?
I'm sorry,
2,000?
Vehicles that can be reduced from the fleet?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. When the study is done, how are we going to auction them off, and are we going to give employees first shot at getting them at maybe a discounted price if it's a vehicle that
Who
somebody would
wants
like?
to buy them?
How are we going to deal with that?
I see $5, 5 I see.
No, I'm dead serious, because obviously this can generate some revenue, but if employees want access to these vehicles.
Ken Desowitz, Director of Supply Services for General Services. I manage the salvage function. Vehicles are sent to auction. We have an auction company. Currently, it's Ken Porter, and that's the method that we would utilize to dispose of vehicles. Employees are not given first shot. There's a issue or perception about selling to city employees. We have to keep everything above board, and
Of course I want it above board. I think it's for nothing. I'm just saying, if one of the employees sees a vehicle that makes sense, would they have an option of getting it?
they can get it at through the Ken Porter Auction Company.
And will that information be disseminated out
It's
to people?
posted on our website. It's also, there's mailing lists that people are familiar with.
So they're in the process now of evaluating the value of it, and if it can be auctioned and all that, or do we already know we have 2,000 vehicles?
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
That's okay. Do we already know we have 2,000 vehicles that are able to be put in this auction?
Through the fleet utilization study, we're confirming the numbers. So right now, as I said, we're doing the utilization study in phases. So for the first phase, we've identified 1,600 vehicles. In the second phase, we've identified about 1,800. However, in identifying these vehicles, we need to talk with the departments, because what we found, for instance, you may have a vehicle that shows up as underutilized, but maybe it's a piece of equipment that ITA uses that they only use when it's a communication piece of equipment, and they only use it when there's a fire. Or so one of the reasons that we're not just going out and taking vehicles is because we have to have discussions with the departments to make sure that this is a vehicle that they don't need.
Okay, and we said 115,000 miles on it. Did I hear that earlier?
We in the police department look at 115,000 miles right now.
Thanks.
That was 115 or 150?
No, 115.
115.
When Councilmember Zion was asking a question about the fuel budget, and you mentioned that we're approaching $1.5 million over for the year, but you mentioned $2 million in the UB was already set aside in case this should occur. The $1.5 million is attributable mainly to what, pricing or volume, or what caused us to go over?
We've actually seen a decrease in volume. The pricing is what's causing us to go over right now. We've seen an increase in the cost of fuel per barrel, so that's what's causing the price up. But we've actually seen a bit of a decrease in volume. So one of the things with fuel, it's very volatile. So we just basically try to keep an eye on it as the year progresses. And if we believe that we need more funding at some point, then that's when we'll come back in and ask for it. But at this point, we believe that with the money and the unappropriated balance, that we're okay at this point.
Okay. All right, thank you. Questions, Mr. Smith?
Well, first of all, I apologize for being a little late, so maybe this is repetitive. I just want to, on what Mr. Rosendahl was talking about, do we have a plan on how to get that number of cars out in an expeditious time to do some value to the budget? Or are we going to just talk about this for another 6 months?
For example, I think, Mr. Smith, because I'm curious too, what is the average number of vehicles that we can actually put back out through our system when we no longer need those vehicles? and then with an analysis and an attempt to try to address an additional 2,000 vehicles, put them to rest and get them off our rolls, would that cause any kind of consternation or problem with our current system based on, is there a volume difference there, or it's pretty much take it in stride?
The auction company schedules auctions twice a month. I think they can accommodate up to a couple hundred vehicles at an auction. So we haven't had a problem in the past of any significant delay. I know there was a time period a couple of years ago where there was a significant number of vehicles that were pushed through the auction process, and it lasted, I think, 6 months to a year. And we realized, I think at that time, around $6 million in revenue through the salvage process.
So basically, if we were to go ahead and identify 2,000 vehicles in the early part of 2011 and then phase them away from usage, you're saying that the current system that we have right now it can handle that kind of output or input, or?
And yes, and if they couldn't, then we could hire another auction company to
Well, that was my next
pick up the
question.
burden.
We're not confined just to the particular auction system that we
Correct.
have right now. We could actually contract for the overage or whatever we want to
Correct.
call it. Okay. And so that industry of auctioning has that capacity.
Yes,
So we have no concerns here. I mean, from your vantage point.
correct.
Okay.
I understand, and my staff wanted to make sure that I said thank you to all of you. I understand you had numerous repetitive meetings over and over and over again to try and find answers to the questions. My concern is that some of this stuff continues on into its second year of talking, and we want answers, not next phase studies, not report backs. I think we asked the question of the police department over 2 years ago. We still don't have answers yet. Before you were there, so I'm not Chief. I'm not saying it was your fault. Your predecessor and certainly Chief Bratton just tried to stonewall this, and we're 2 years into this discussion. We still don't have answers about how the fleet got so big so fast, and then what we're going to do to bring it back down. So I just want to know when closure's coming to some of this. You said you're in another phase now of the consultant.
Well, the fleet utilization study is currently in progress, and as Angela mentioned, it should...
Phase 2, though, right?
Well, we don't have to call it anything by phases. We have to wait for the study to be completed before we can report back to you with a list of potential vehicles for reduction. So we anticipate that to wrap up within the first couple of months of the new year, and then we can come back and provide recommendations for which actual vehicles or pieces of equipment should be reduced.
Okay. My biggest concern is not so much with, although that's been a concern of mine for a couple of years now in the budget, is what's happening in particular with the fire fleet as far as maintenance goes. And that's my greatest concern, that as we stretch out our fleets, as we put more miles on the vehicles than we had in past, I see in particular the police department, the fire department, that the ability of the maintenance staff to maintain them is lessening because of ERIP and other programs that we just don't have the people. So this is really a question of the CAO that we need to be very cognizant of in this year's budget, that as we go into another year of stretching the fleet, that means another year of patching them together and keeping them running, which means more mechanics, more costs for parts and labor, which begin to exponentially increase, probably diametrically opposed to the decrease in the number of vehicles you're purchasing. So at some point, there becomes a breaking point. And I don't know if our consultants have been asked that question, where is the breaking point of the system? But at some point or other, those lines become crisscrossed and you can't fix then the problem, ever. So is that part of your requirement on the consultants to give us those kind of answers too?
Yes, it is. That's part of the fleet utilization study.
Okay. And so we can expect that back in the first quarter, or before budget?
Yes,
Very good.
before budget.
All right.
February actually was mentioned earlier in the meeting, correct?
Yes.
February. Yeah, good. Well, one of the things that I asked before you came in, Mr. Smith, was does GSD have the authority to retrieve vehicles or take vehicles out of departments, and they don't. At the same time, I think that one of the things that confuses the public, and I think frustrates many of us, is there was a big headline when the mayor gave a directive that we should reduce the fleet of vehicles that are within the panoply of vehicles that the city government actually has and is paying for and maintaining and has purchased. But unfortunately, that directive didn't result in a massive reduction of vehicles. It wasn't like a bunch of people were calling GSD saying, I got 6 vehicles for you to pick up. I got 10 vehicles for you to pick up. Please come get them. Those calls didn't happen. The number of vehicles that actually got turned in were nowhere near the thousands of vehicles that was expected, and it was announced by a big hoopla. And unfortunately, what we're contending with, and the frustration is that, and I tried to clarify that the frustration I don't believe should be directed toward GSD. It really is the individual departments that were asked. They were not required, but they were asked to please turn in vehicles. They did not turn in vehicles, and now what we have is a report coming out in February where the council is going to have to do the work of, through a motion, actually require certain identified vehicles that they be given up and that they no longer be part of our fleet. So that's the unfortunate part about this whole process. Everybody got happy because a bunch of news media was reporting that the mayor was getting tough on expenditures in the city and that all kinds of vehicles were going to stop being used and we can auction them off or what have you, reduce the general fund budget dependency for these vehicles, maybe make a little bit of money on the back end, put that back into the general fund. That didn't happen. So I understand your frustration, Councilmember Smith, but unfortunately the headlines don't necessarily mean that any work got done. So this is where the real work is getting done. And on that note, as you said earlier, Mr. Smith, a lot of good people have been working really, really hard. I'd just like to point out a few of you and thank you very, very much. You've been working with a lot of our staffs, Mandana and June from the CLA's office, the fleet managers, Barton, Vince, and Chris Colson, management staff, Rhonda Sims, Lewis, Chiefs Varela, Ulrich, and Fox, and Chief Sandy Joe from LAPD. I want to thank you all very, very much. It's a thankless job to do all of this work when the public actually thinks that it's already been done. And the work has been getting done, and I want to thank all of you for doing that. With that, I'd like to ask an additional question. Were you done with the questions at this moment, Mr. Smith? I wanted to ask a question about when it comes to contracting out for services, when it comes to fleets, fleet vehicles and maintenance, et cetera. Any comment on where we're at there and what we're going through?
Contracting out is recommended to be in place as a short-term option that could help to mitigate the staffing shortage, but on a permanent or ongoing basis, it is not recommended because when we looked at some, rates, compared them with the county and the current city's purchasing contracts that are in place with some of the vendors, as an example, the city rate for a heavy-duty equipment mechanic, including the cap rate, is approximately $74 an hour, and the average of the city's current purchasing agent contracts is about $83 an hour, and that doesn't include their potential overtime that they could charge. So on a permanent or ongoing basis, contracting out is not recommended, but it's an important tool to have in place to mitigate the staffing shortfall that the departments face.
So contracting out is certainly not recommended as a long-term solution, but only as a stopgap on a solution on an immediate basis.
Correct.
And one of the reasons why it's not recommended, because the analysis is that contracting out is more expensive, although perhaps necessary on a moment-to-moment basis, but in the short term and long term, there's no question that it's more expensive.
Correct. On an ongoing basis, it would be more expensive.
Mr. Zine and then Mr. Smith.
And just a couple questions on contracting out. If we would modify the furlough plan, couldn't we use some of those dollars to help have our city workers do that instead of contracting out? If we're going to contract out, it's going to cost money. If we would reduce some of the furlough on specific issues, wouldn't that balance out better?
Well, throughout this report, what we emphasized is that it's always better to do the work in-house before going to contracting out as an option. So to the extent that it's feasible and the departments can help it, they will always try to do the work in-house.
Yeah, I'm talking about the furlough, because
The
there's
furlough,
mechanics and furloughs.
that's actually something that, it's one of the recommendations in the report, and the CLA and CAO are going to have to look at that issue more closely and report back for some alternatives.
Because if a contractor comes and picks up the vehicle and takes it to their shop, or we deliver it, whatever the case may be, they do the work there, then deliver it back, I'm sure they're charged from the time they pick the vehicle up,
Right.
go to the shop, wherever it may be, we'll fix it and come back. So we're paying for drive time, in addition to the maintenance and the parts, et cetera, at a higher rate. And if we were to take the furlough people who are on whatever furlough plan they're on and modify that to say, okay, we want to catch this backlog and keep it in-house, where the mechanics are there, they're city employees, we've got everything there, and pay them to do it, it seems to be more economical and less hassle than, and I don't know where the contractors are, but if they're traveling 20 or 30 miles, and we're paying for them to go 20 or 30 miles, and then 20, 30 miles back, we're spending a lot of money to have them drive the vehicle.
Right.
And in addition to the parts, which I'm sure we're paying the premium price for versus, and I look at the in-house, if we didn't have in-house, we got people in-house on furloughs. So if we're going to contract out, let's modify the furlough plan and let those folks do the work. It seems very logical.
The let's modify is a council decision, and that's why we have the budget guys here. But
Well, you're paying for it one way or another. Either you're going to contract, you're going to pay for it, you do it in-house, you're going to pay for it. But it seems in-house is a little more practical and economical.
But relief of furloughing is a policy.
I'm not saying total relief. I'm saying
No,
those
but even a
situations.
modification. Modification is a policy decision, and that would very likely not happen unless the Budget Committee actually forwarded that recommendation. But I apologize earlier, we did, in fact, I announced that we did not have a quorum of the Budget Committee. We do. Mr. Smith has been here for quite some time. I apologize, Mr. Smith. So just for the record, we have had a quorum of both committees for...
Yeah, 'cause I need that overtime, so.
You get overtime? I don't get overtime.
But I just like
You got furloughs,
to
too.
add, for the record, that we explore, and the supervisors who are supervisors in the particular entities, if there could be a modification on specific issues where those employees, and I'm not saying all of them, however it would work, in other words, instead of contracting out if we're going to pay for it, what will it take to do it in-house if we modify the furlough? And in specific cases, not a blanket reduction or elimination.
Okay.
He's asking for a report back, I think.
You can't do
Well, I'm not asking for a report back. What I'm asking for is how feasible it would be. Well, I am asking for a report back. How feasible it would be, because you mentioned contracting out. My concern is contracting out's costing us money, and if we take that money and do it in-house, we could probably get more bang for our buck. That's what I'm looking at.
Let me just comment on that. One of the things, I think we discussed this in other areas, I think the MOUs pretty well negate our ability to alter person by person or unit by unit, because the MOUs basically puts certain level of furloughs on its members, and any alteration of that, which we saw recently with modified staffing, it will blow up the budget even further. And so I think that there's some major limitations on MOUs and negotiation.
Well, no, my point, Mr. Parks, is if we're going to spend the money on an outside contractor, those same dollars, I'd rather invest inside. I'm not asking for additional dollars. I'm talking about in lieu of contracting.
I think what I'm trying to say is, I think the dilemma is you can't alter the MOU per person. You'd have to then go by the class or the union, and then it really is expensive if you alter furlough days for a large group of employees that are under contract.
Mr. Smith?
Yeah, I was going to, but and I totally agree with what Mr. Parks is saying, that it's just, we legally can't do that because of the agreement we have with the unions. However, what we could do, and what I talked to the unions about, is an opportunity to do what we do in some of the construction trades is, and have a union hall concept, that if demand in the shops dictate it, say we have a huge fire and you got a lot of beat up equipment, or a North Hollywood shooting, for God's sakes, but you got a bunch of beat up equipment, that you could go to a hiring hall and pick up people that are union people that come in and do short-term work, hourly work, to fill voids that we have. It's much more efficient, and it's union-oriented as well. And
They do it on our facility.
yeah, and we do that in our construction trades. We do that with our IBEW does it, our guys that do the street work do it. So and I'd call upon, I see some of the unit leadership here has come back maybe with an idea where we could create a union hiring hall to do some of that kind of stuff. Then we could pick up with those kind of people right out of the union, and it meets with their concerns, and at the same time fills our need on an hourly or daily basis.
Did you have another question? Okay, all right.
You noted that, though, right? But we just...
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Any other elements to your report?
No other comments at this time.
Okay, thank you very much. We do have a public comment card. We're on items 1 and 2. Yes.
Let me just ask CEO, could you give us some idea of you
CLA,
and the CLA on recommendation 6, when we might get a report back on it, on the
Sure.
take-home vehicle aspect that I think Mr. Smith alluded to, that it's been about 2 years?
Our goal is to have a report back for you within the first, I'm going to say within the first 2 months of the new year, so January, February.
All right. Is this plan to be part of that February report that you were talking about earlier?
The take-home vehicle aspect.
You were talking about a February report on other...
That will be for the fleet utilization survey that's conducted
Could we get this
through
at the same
GSD.
time?
We can try to, yes.
Can we look at that for February?
At the latest, yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. We have public comment card. Julie Butcher?
I can try and confuse us more on this furlough issue, but with all due respect, you are the Budget Committee, so I assume you knew what you did. There is no agreement on furloughs. So if you want to unfurlough mechanics today, we are fine with that. The fact is that you have furloughed selectively, so the folks that are not furloughed are the folks that are paid for through a special fund. That happens to be random, and that the fire mechanics and police mechanics and a bulk of the general services mechanics have all been furloughed without agreement. So we would be happy to have any number of them. If you can unfurlough 2 of them, that would be okay with the union that represents them. There is no agreement that provided for furloughs. We have been very reasonable about looking at contracting as a stopgap, because amazingly enough, these vehicles do not fix themselves. So you have increased the number of police officers, you have maintained the number of firefighters, and yet we have fewer mechanics. So, frankly, with all due respect, that we would furlough them at 10% is ludicrous. So, if you can act, there is no opposition from the union. You could unfurlough them today. They could get back to work. The fact is that these are safety issues. These are matters of maintaining an expert service. I think it's important to acknowledge what your mechanics do. And the fact that you manage to keep... These are experts. Nobody does it better, and the fact is nobody does it cheaper.
Right.
True.
So, let's work together. I think the amazing essence of this report is really a step towards acting like this is all one city, that we are all in this together. So again, that you've furloughed fire mechanics but not trash mechanics is based on funding source solely. It doesn't make any operational sense. So we would encourage you to immediately unfurlough as many of the mechanics as you can, so we can continue to provide this excellent service that we provide more cost effectively than anybody on the planet.
Anything else, Ms. Butcher?
No.
Let me ask you, do you have a recommendation of what would get cut if you brought furloughed employees back and had to pay them?
Well, perhaps some of the contracts that are more expensive.
Well, I think we've gone through that, and
I haven't seen any contracts cut. Truth is that actually General Services has done a good job of engaging with contractors and seeing some reduction, but they're not using that money to offset service cuts.
last report we had, I think, with the 10%, it was somewhere like $2 to $3 million. It wasn't the multi-million-dollar windfall that most people...
Well, you haven't heard a report on that in months.
Okay.
So I'd urge you to actually do that. But the other thing is, I mean, frankly, all due respect, we've reduced the size of the workforce by 4,000 people. There should be a concomitant reduction in the number of vehicles, and we should look at giving up those things that are non-essential. But mechanics fixing your vehicles don't seem to be the area that I would cut.
I think if you look at the city council agenda, but in the last week or so, there was a document that was forthcoming that talked about personal service contracts and contracts overall that listed what the savings were, and I think it was like in the $2 to $3 million.
Okay.
And part of that is actually, I think there was a recommendation that you could cut the actual allocation in the budget rather than asking them to come and do it, because if you ask them to come and do it, then they
I
won't.
think the CAO viewed that what they were doing was appropriate and that they could not do it otherwise. That's why they maintained their contract.
I think it was just the other way.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Butcher. I do not see any other public comment cards on items 1 or 2. Is there anybody else here to make public comment on item 1 or 2? Seeing no one come forward and no public comment cards before us on items 1 and 2, public comment on items 1 and 2 is now closed. With that was a report. What are we doing? Okay. So there's a motion to adopt the CLA report from the IT committee. Is that deemed approved? Okay, that item's approved. Yes.
And for item 1?
For item 1,
Are you adopting
the same. Adopt the report.
Adopt the motion?
Yeah. Adopt the report on item 1 and on item 2. Okay, that's approved from the IT committee. Mr. Chairman of the Budget Committee?
Budget Committee will move both 1 and 2 on the recommendations of the motion on item 1 and the CLA-CAO recommendations on the December 13th report.
Okay. Okay, concurrent actions then? Okay. Unanimous on both committees. With that, we move to item number 3.
For item 3, I believe this will be in closed session.
Can I go in the back?
Why don't we sit here?
Okay. Okay, whoever isn't part of the appropriate city staff on item number 3, we will secure this room instead of going in the back room there. Sensitive to people accusing us of backroom dealings, we'll stay in this front room.
There you go.
Plus, it's not smoky enough. The smoke-filled room.
There you go. Got to add that element. Right? The fat cat sitting back there making deals. You want to take the lead on this? You've been working on the details a little bit more than me. Yeah. That was amazingly resistant, man.
It's already been sucked up.
Yep.
You're talking about 3 million?
That's right.
Light's still on.
After he makes the announcement.
Ready
You
to
make the announcement.
Yeah, we can make an announcement.
Are we set?
The committees will now proceed into closed session to address the items that appear on today's agenda regarding this matter.